William Wallace, no older than a boy, walked alone. No torch in his hand, no fear in his step, just the weight of fresh grief pressing into his bones. The forest around him was heavy with silence, not the silence of peace, but the silence of something smothered, like a scream that never made it out of the throat. Behind him, the village mourned in secret. Mothers wept behind locked doors. Fathers stared into dying fires, eyes hollow, voices gone. The English had ridden through like a plague, taking grain, dignity, and blood. William's father had been the last to resist. They made an example of him. The boy didn't cry when they dragged his father's body through the center of town. He didn't cry when the English knight spat at his feet and said, "This is what loyalty to Scotland brings." He didn't cry when the rain came and refused to stop. But tonight, something called him into the woods. He followed the path they used to walk together. His father's voice echoed in his memory. "When you walk the forest, walk like the trees are listening. Speak only when your soul has something worth saying." The forest, once full of life, now felt cursed. Branches reached out like fingers, gnarled and twisted. The air smelled of wet earth and old iron, like something ancient had been bled here long before him. Then he saw it, a tree, tall, dead, alone in a small clearing. Nailed to its center was a hand, large, calloused, familiar. The blood had dried, but the flies still buzzed in devotion. It was his father's, not the body, just the hand, nailed to the bark with an English dagger. A message. The boy didn't scream. He didn't blink. He just stared. His fingers curled slowly into fists, his jaw locked. He walked toward it, reached out, and touched the dried blood with the tips of his fingers. It was cold, but the rage it sparked was fire. A whisper drifted through the trees, not a voice, not a language, just a sound made of breath and vengeance. Vengeance lives in the blood. William turned, but no one was there. The trees creaked, the mist thickened, and something inside him broke and rebuilt itself in the same breath. The boy who had walked into the woods died in that clearing, and something else stepped out. He returned to the village with the dagger still in his hand. He said nothing, but when the others saw the look in his eyes, they understood. Not grief, not despair, purpose, wordless, bottomless, and ancient. The next morning the tree was gone, burned to ash. No one knew by whom, but the villagers noticed the birds didn't land there anymore. Children were told to stay away from the forest, and William Wallace changed. He stopped speaking unless he needed to. He trained with wood and steel alone for hours. He didn't look at the sky the way boys do. He looked at it like it owed him something. One night, the village priest found him behind the church, carving the names of English lords into stone, then smashing the stones with a hammer. When asked what he was doing, William said only, "Learning who I'll meet when I grow up." Time passed. The English kept coming. More soldiers, more orders, more nooses. But Elderslie did not rise up. It obeyed, it bent, it wept. Only the boy stood straight. And as his shoulders broadened and his hands grew calloused with blade and steel, so did the storm within him. Some nights villagers claimed they heard crying from the woods, but not human. Something low, something broken, something ancient. Others said the tree had come back, twisted, bleeding, screaming when the wind hit it just right. But William never spoke of it. He never went back. He didn't need to, because that night had never left him. It lived in his footsteps. It burned behind his silence. It whispered in his dreams. And when he finally picked up a real sword for the first time, it felt like remembering something, not learning it. Elderslie slept on, but the silence was not peace. It was waiting, waiting for the day the boy would become the ghost they created, waiting for the scream that hadn't yet left his throat to finally be heard. And when it came, it would shake the crown itself. The sky over Stirling was black with storm and smoke. Rain fell in sheets, but the earth drank only blood. Beneath the looming bridge, where water once flowed freely, bodies now choked the riverbed, English and Scottish alike. But more of theirs, always more of theirs. William Wallace stood at the edge of the chaos, his sword clutched in a blood-slicked hand. He was no longer the boy from Elderslie. The silence of his village had been replaced with the screams of the dying. And still he didn't speak, not unless the moment demanded it. The English had come with their banners high, with armor polished and horses proud. They expected surrender. They expected fear. What they met was hell wearing a tartan. Wallace's rebels weren't an army. They were shadows, woodsmen, farmers, thieves, hardened not by training, but by starvation and grief. They didn't march, they hunted. As the English began crossing the narrow bridge, Wallace gave the signal. Arrows rained first, then fire, then men. The bridge groaned beneath the weight of blood and iron. The English couldn't move forward, couldn't retreat, and Wallace was already among them. He moved like a ghost, silent but devastating. His blade didn't sing, it snarled. He did not duel, he butchered. An English knight tried to parry and lost his arm. Another begged for mercy. Wallace slit his throat without a word. A third reached for a fallen banner. Wallace drove a dagger through his back and pinned him to it. All around him his men fought with the fury of the forgotten. Screams echoed like chants. The river turned red. One soldier, crawling through the mud, looked up and saw Wallace's face. Not rage, not hate, just emptiness. "Mercy," the soldier choked. Wallace didn't answer. The sword did. By the time the sun broke through the clouds, it was too late for light to save anyone. The bridge was broken, the river clogged with corpses. The crows arrived before the priests. Wallace stood alone on the battlefield, soaked in blood from throat to boot. His eyes scanned the carnage with the cold calm of someone who expected nothing less. A dying English officer dragged himself forward, leaving a crimson trail behind. With his final breath, he whispered, "You fight like death itself." Wallace knelt beside him, close enough only for the dying to hear. His voice was gravel and fire. "Death taught me." Then he closed the man's eyes with the back of his hand and stood. His men didn't cheer. They didn't celebrate. They buried their friends with broken hands and drank from the helmets of the dead. Victory had come, but it didn't feel like triumph. It felt like warning. That day Scotland shook, but not from glory, from rage, from a fire that couldn't be put out with treaties or gold. Wallace looked to the hills as ravens circled above. The wind howled across the bloodied land. Some said they heard it speak. "More will come." Wallace tightened his grip on the sword. Let them.
They say there are places in Scotland that drink moonlight like blood and never give it back. Forests older than kings, hills that whisper your name before you've even stepped on the path. William Wallace wandered into one of these places, not as a warrior, not even as a man, but as a soul in search of something he couldn't name. The trees were too still, the air too thick. It didn't feel like nature, it felt like waiting. There was no trail to follow, yet his feet moved like he knew where he was going. The deeper he walked, the stranger it became. Bark shifted beneath his touch, stones hummed when he passed. Every breath he took felt like an intrusion. Something watched him, but it wasn't the kind of gaze that sought to kill. It was the kind that already owned you. That's when he saw her, standing barefoot in the middle of a stream that should have drowned her ankles but didn't touch her at all. Her presence bent the world around her. Her skin pale as ice, hair dark as midnight sin. Her eyes shimmered with the colour of drowning stars. She wore a gown woven from mist and shadow, and when she blinked, it was as if centuries had passed between each motion. She smiled, not kindly, not cruelly, just knowingly. "You have come far, son of steel," she said, her voice dripping like warm honey over frost. "Far enough to meet your undoing." Wallace said nothing. He wanted to speak. He tried, but his tongue felt chained, his body rooted. She had not cast a spell on him. She was the spell, a myth made flesh, a curse wrapped in beauty. He swallowed hard and finally found the words, "Who are you?" Her smile deepened, and the wind around them shivered like it feared her. "They call me many things, witch, fey, demon, spirit, but I am none of those things. I am the queen of the damned north. I am the sorrow that lives between the snow and the scream. And you, William Wallace, are already cursed." The moment she said his name, he flinched. How she knew it, he didn't ask. He already knew the answer. This was not a meeting by chance. This was fate dragging him by the throat. She reached out and touched his chest, right above his heart. Her fingers burned cold, like winter set to flame. "This," she whispered, "is where it lives. The burden, the vengeance, the fire. You carry a nation inside a wound." He closed his eyes as images flooded his mind, visions of Scotland, unchained and roaring, banners rising, castles falling, freedom wild and fierce. But with every vision came a shadow. Friends dying, brothers screaming, villagers slaughtered. The price was never hidden. It danced alongside the dream like a partner in a funeral waltz. "Every step forward," she said, her voice like thunder inside a whisper, "will cost a soul, and you, my love, are already in debt." He tried to resist, tried to break from the vision, but she was already beside him now, lips against his ear. "Let it go," she said. "Let the boy die. Become what you are meant to be." And in that moment, everything inside him unraveled. The night that followed wasn't a night, it was a ritual. Their bodies met like storms colliding. Her skin felt like silk dipped in ash. Her kiss was poison and prophecy. She spoke in ancient tongues, words he didn't know but understood with every broken piece of himself. He felt her soul press against his, not lovingly, but completely, as if claiming him. The world bent, trees moaned, stars blinked out. And somewhere, deep in the dirt of forgotten graves, the dead stirred. When he woke, she was gone. The stream was dry, the stones were cracked, and he was alone lying in a bed of dead birds, with their wings curled in silent agony. No footprints, no blood, no trace of her, except for one thing. A scar, thin, jagged, fresh. It sat just over his heart, pulsing slightly with each breath. He touched it, winced, and in that moment her voice returned, echoing through the hollow of his chest. "Freedom will love you, then it will eat you." He stood slowly, legs trembling from something more than weakness. The wind around him felt wrong, like it too had seen things it wanted to forget. As he put his clothes back on, he noticed the forest no longer watched him. It pitied him, like it knew what was coming, like it knew he would never walk the same. When Wallace returned to camp, the men looked at him strangely. They didn't ask where he had been. They didn't need to. Something about him had changed. His voice was quieter, his stare longer, his silence heavier. That night he sat by the fire and sharpened his blade, not because it was dull, but because it helped him pretend his hand still belonged to him. Someone passed him a drink. He didn't take it. His thoughts were elsewhere. He saw her when he closed his eyes, not in memory, but as if she were still watching, not just from the shadows, but from inside him. The scar ached in rhythm with the flames. And the longer he stared into the fire, the more it looked like her eyes, cold, all-knowing, and waiting for him to keep the promise he didn't remember making. He never spoke of her again, but she never left. When the moon bled red and the wind screamed down from the mountains, the others would tremble. But Wallace, he would simply look to the horizon and whisper a name he didn't say out loud. The Phantom Queen.
They crowned him not with gold, but with necessity. William Wallace, the warrior, the rebel, the ghost of Stirling, now sat as guardian of Scotland. It was never meant to be a throne. It was a cage made of titles and distrust. The nobles flinched when he entered their halls, like dogs wary of a wolf they couldn't leash. They called him leader in daylight, but behind closed doors they called him savage. They feared his scars, they hated his silence, they respected his victories, but not his voice. Scotland, fractured and bleeding, needed unity. Wallace bled for it. They schemed around it. He noticed the whispers first, quiet exchanges in dark corners, messengers who rode too fast and returned too quiet. Then he heard names, English names, Edward's names. Nobles, Scottish nobles, making offers to the same crown that murdered their kin and burned their homes. Wallace didn't confront them immediately. He watched, waited, let the rot reveal itself. And when it did, he didn't storm in with speeches. He brought a head. It was dropped on the map in the middle of their secret meeting. A severed English head, still warm, blood soaking into the ink that marked borders no longer real. The nobles recoiled. Some shouted. One even reached for a dagger. Wallace didn't flinch. "You wear crowns of gold, but your hearts are blacker than mine." They called him barbarian. He called them traitors. They reminded him that peace required diplomacy. He reminded them that peace was buried in mass graves. One noble dared accuse him of dragging Scotland into darkness. Wallace leaned in and whispered, "You were born in darkness. I just chose not to close my eyes." The meeting ended without votes, without hands raised, just silence, and that head still staring up from the map, mouth open like it had been trying to scream a warning. That night, Wallace didn't sleep. He sat alone, sharpening his blade until the whetstone cracked. When his eyes finally closed, the dreams came like a storm. He saw a crown, heavy and beautiful, melting into blood, dripping down stone steps, filling the eyes of a child who looked just like him. Voices echoed in the darkness. Some he knew, some he didn't, all of them saying the same thing. This is not freedom. This is fury dressed as justice. He woke before dawn, drenched in sweat, his hands clenched tight around nothing. The next day, none of the nobles mentioned the meeting, but the map was burned, and Wallace never entered that chamber again without a blade on his belt and a warning in his eyes. Scotland had a guardian, but it no longer had a council, just a battlefield and a man willing to bleed on it. The letter came sealed in red wax, stamped with the crest of old allies, promises of men, steel and banners, reinforcements for a final push. Wallace read it twice, then once more, alone. He wanted to believe. He needed to. They said the meeting would be private, safe, neutral ground. He rode out with hope, chained to doubt. The hills were quiet, too quiet. He dismounted as the mist rolled in. Waiting under the crooked trees was a familiar face, his oldest friend, once a brother in blood and battle. The man didn't smile. He didn't move. Wallace stepped forward. "I heard you called for me." The friend nodded, eyes glassy. Then soldiers stepped from the shadows, English armor, Scottish cloaks. Too many to fight, too late to run. Wallace looked at him, really looked. The silence was louder than a scream. The man walked forward, reached out like he might embrace him. Instead, he shackled his wrists. "I'm sorry, Will," he whispered. Wallace didn't struggle. He didn't speak. He stared at the hands that once lifted him from mud and now dragged him into betrayal. The chains bit into his skin. The taste of metal filled his mouth as they struck him. The villagers saw the procession the next morning. Wallace, bloodied and bound, dragged like a criminal through the town he'd once defended. No one threw stones. No one dared look long. A woman began to cry. Not from fear, but from shame. One by one, heads bowed, not to the English, to guilt. Wallace raised his chin through swollen lips, his eye nearly closed, his mouth bleeding. He spat onto the ground, a thick ribbon of red across English boots. Then he looked at the traitor, who still couldn't meet his gaze, and said, clear enough for every trembling soul to hear, even Judas wept.
They brought him to London, not as a prisoner, but as a trophy. Chains clinked with every step, dragged across cobblestones polished with rain and filth. Crowds lined the streets, mouths open like wolves sniffing blood. Children jeered, women crossed themselves. Some men threw bones from the feast table as if mocking a dog. But Wallace didn't snarl. He walked, slow and upright, even with broken ribs beneath the bruises. When they reached the tower, the air shifted. He could feel it in his lungs, the weight of the place, the stink of fear masked by perfumes and powdered wigs. This wasn't justice, it was theater. A play written in advance with only one ending: pain. The courtroom was a cathedral of mockery. Velvet curtains, marble columns, golden crests overhead, and behind it all, cowards cloaked as kings. The nobles stared like men seeing a bear in chains, entertained only because they believed it couldn't bite. They called him the Beast of the North. They called him outlaw. They called him traitor. He said nothing. Not when they listed his so-called crimes. Not when they accused him of burning villages they themselves had razed. Not even when they laughed at his clothes, his face, his silence. He stood still, not proud, not defiant, but steady, unbreakable. Then came the sentence. They didn't wait. They didn't pretend. The trial ended before it began. The judge, more actor than arbiter, declared him guilty with a grin. And then came the knives. They stripped him down to skin and bone and tied him upright. The crowd expected a speech. Wallace gave them none, so they made him scream. They started with his fingernails, each one pulled slow, deliberate. No questions, no ceremony, just the sound of flesh being unmade. Blood soaked into the wooden floor. He clenched his jaw, he gritted his teeth, but he did not cry out. One noble leaned forward, watching with sick fascination. Another laughed too loudly, as if trying to forget the fear settling in his gut. The priest whispered, "Confess and be forgiven." Still, Wallace said nothing, until the 6th nail. He raised his head. Blood trailed from his lips. His hands shook, but his voice cut through the room like ice breaking in a winter lake. "You will remember this face," he said, teeth red, eyes hollow, "when your children wake screaming at night." Silence. Complete. The laughter died. The guards paused. Even the executioner took a step back. A noble dropped his wine, the goblet shattered. The priest clutched his book like it might protect him. Wallace didn't blink, didn't flinch. He smiled, just a little. Not with joy, not with peace, but with venom.
and in that courtroom of gold and gore, the only sound was blood dripping like a broken clock. Tick, tick, tick. They marched him through the streets like a devil captured, but he did not look like a monster. He looked like a man who had lost everything, and yet still refused to kneel. His body was broken, ribs shattered, skin torn from lashes and chains. But he walked, barefoot, blood trailing behind him, with the silence of a king who knew even death would not bury his name. His hands were bound, but his spine stayed straight. He didn't beg. He didn't blink. He only stared ahead as the crowd parted like water around a ghost. They came in thousands, from far towns, cities, even the countryside. They climbed rooftops and leaned from windows. Some cursed him, others prayed. Most just watched, hungry for blood, thirsty for spectacle. They called him the beast, the savage, the mad rebel of the North. But as they looked down at him, what they saw wasn't fury or filth, it was resolve. They expected a monster. What they saw was a man who would not scream. The executioner had killed many, but this one was different. His hands trembled as he looped the noose around Wallace's neck. Wallace looked him in the eye, and for a second it was as if the blade itself were being judged. No hate, no fear, just the quiet knowledge of what had to be done. The trapdoor opened. Wallace dropped. His body jerked. His eyes bulged, but no sound came from his throat. He hung there, twitching, struggling for breath, and still nothing. Before death could take him, they cut him down. Not mercy, ritual. The next act began. Drawn. Ropes around his limbs, arms pulled to one side, legs to another, stretched until joint snapped and ligament tore from the bone. The people gasped. A woman turned away, sobbing. A child buried their face in their father's chest. One noble grinned, but it didn't reach his eyes. The sky began to darken. Storm clouds, thick and unnatural, brewed above the square. No thunder, no wind, just a weight in the air like judgment descending. Even the ravens grew quiet. Then came the quartering. 4 horses, 4 ropes, his limbs tied to each one. Wallace looked to the executioner, not in plea, but in understanding. The nod was small, the command was given. The horses charged, his body tore. A sound like wet branches snapping echoed through the square. Some screamed, some vomited. One man fell to his knees and began to pray aloud. The sky rumbled. A raven landed on the gallows beam, huge, black, and silent. It turned once, stared into Wallace's eyes, then cawed, a single note that sounded like death itself. And Wallace, somehow still breathing, blood pouring from his mouth, managed to lift his head one final time. No scream, just a whisper, shaky, guttural, and soaked in defiance. Freedom. Then his head fell. His chest went still. The storm finally broke. Rain fell like ash, sharp and fast, washing blood across the stone. People scattered. The executioner dropped his blade, fell to his knees. He had ended kings and criminals, but this was no sentence. This was a memory carved into the bones of the land. Later he would say the raven followed him home. Later he would never sleep again. They called Wallace a rebel, a savage, a ghost. But when he died, the earth trembled, and no one ever forgot the man who did not scream.
Years passed. The war ended. Kings rose, treaties signed, lands divided, but something was left behind. Not a body, not a ghost, something deeper, something colder. The highlands whispered it first, then the winds near Stirling, then the hills around Elderslie. Travellers spoke of strange things, fog that moved like breath, cold that clung like hands, in a figure, always alone, always watching. They called it myth, folklore, madness, but those who saw it never laughed again. They said a weeping man wandered the mist, tall, limping, face hidden in shadow. His breath fogged the air even when it wasn't cold. His steps made no sound. Sometimes, in the dead hours before dawn, soldiers on patrol vanished, entire units. No screams, no blood, just silence. The English called it cursed ground. The Scots called it sacred. One patrol swore they saw him just beyond the trees, wrapped in fog so thick they could barely make out his shape. They raised their weapons, blinked, he was gone. Only a trail of footprints remained, leading nowhere. Another claimed they heard someone muttering in Old Scots, "Free men blade, but never kneel." A bard once sang in a tavern, drunk and pale-faced, his voice barely above a whisper. He died in pieces, but rose as one. Wallace walks still, blade of none. He bears no steel, no sword, no crown. His fury walks this frozen ground. They silenced him quickly, but the song stuck. Children dared each other to climb the hills near Stirling in foggy nights. None lasted more than a minute. One boy returned with white in his hair, stuttering, swearing he saw a man with burning eyes and no face. They thought it was a tale, until the boy stopped speaking completely. Some say his spirit was born again in fire. Others say the land itself rose up to keep his name alive. But those who know, truly know, do not speak it. Because some deaths are too loud to stay buried, some names too heavy to stay in stone, and some men do not end, they echo. Now and then a campfire flickers out for no reason. A blade rusts overnight. A horse refuses to move. And someone, always someone, feels eyes on their back. Eyes that remember betrayal. Eyes that remember pain. Eyes that remember how freedom tastes through blood. There is no grave, no monument, just fog and wind in the sound of boots on ancient earth. In the final breath of twilight, when the wind howls just right, and the mist curls thick around the hills, a silhouette can be seen on the cliffs above, tall, still, crowned not in gold, but in vengeance. His eyes burn like coals that never die, and though no sword rests in his hand, no man dares walk toward him, because they know what waits. Not death, not mercy, just memory. William Wallace walks still.